Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth in our series of liberal arts lunch and learn presentations. My name is Bill Hessert. I'm the Director of Strategic Communications for the College of the Liberal Arts. And at this point, I would like to introduce everyone to our moderator, Scott Bennett, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies for the college. Scott?
Great. Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you are fine wherever you are. On behalf of Dean Clarence Lang and the college, welcome to our final Lunch and Learn presentation that's featured members of our liberal arts faculty who are exploring several different dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome back to those who have attended before, and welcome for the first time for those of you joining us new. This series is intended to be just a fun opportunity for the college to highlight some relevant, very timely research taking place in the college that helps us understand and respond to some of the most pressing issues that we are facing in society today. The talks remind us of the important role of the liberal arts in tackling critical national and global issues, because it's not just about devising better medical tests and improving hospital systems, but it's about having substantive experts to talk about details of policy solutions and how we deal with semi-governmental organizations and clean water. Having experts in psychology who can talk about stress and anxiety and parenting in a crisis. Having experts who study political behavior who can talk about how to turn out the vote and how social protest and health concerns will affect that. And today it's about having expert economists who can talk to us without spin about things that are important to us all, like economic recovery. And beyond all these individual fields where we've had our speakers, the liberal arts, as we know, has always been about thinking creatively and critically, considering diverse viewpoints that we've heard, communicating effectively, and acting in response to that knowledge. Those core liberal arts values are as important today as they ever have been. So thanks for your interest in the presentations, and thanks for your ongoing support, your hard work with engagement with the college over many years. Two quick housekeeping items. So recordings of our first 3 sessions are now available on the college's YouTube channel. A recording of this session will be available in the next few days. If you have trouble accessing those, please contact Bill Hessert. It's swh4@psu.edu. And second, a reminder that you can submit questions at any time today using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see a Q&A button, normally you can just scroll your mouse across the bottom and it will pop up. So feel free to enter your questions anytime during the presentation. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Barry Ickes. Barry is professor and head of our Department of Economics. He's been a member of the Penn State faculty since earning his PhD from Cal Berkeley in 1984. He's also the director of the Center for Research on International Financial Security at Penn State. Barry's a noted expert on Russia and on centrally planned economies and on economic transition. Along with many articles, he's written 3 books with co-author Clifford Gaddy. The first in 2002 focused on Russia's virtual economy. The second in 2013 was titled Russia's Road to Modernization. And his most recent volume is titled Russia's Addiction: How Oil, Gas, and the Soviet Legacy Have Shaped a Nation's Fate. That volume was released earlier this year by the Brookings Institute Press. Barry is a former senior fellow with the Brookings Institute Center on the United States and Europe. He's a previous chair of the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research, a former consultant to the World Bank and to the OECD, former visiting scholar at the IMF, and a past president of the Association for Comparative Economic Studies. And Barry is also a founder and current financial director of the New Economic School in Moscow. So Barry, we're delighted that you could join us today to discuss something that is not specifically about Russia, but is also at the forefront of all of our minds, which is economic recovery from COVID-19. So thank you for joining us. Take it away.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay, so let me share the screen. I can get my slides here. Where did they go? Here they are. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about economic recovery from the pandemic. What are the basic questions? The basic question is, why is this period not just a great vacation. I mean, we all took, the lockdown sent us home. When the lockdown ends, we all go back to work. The recession, the downturn in the economy is just like we all took a great vacation. We get a rapid recovery. The question is, why is that unlikely to be the case? I'll talk about what are the barriers to rapid recovery, and I'll talk a little bit about why the stock market has behaved differently from the rest of the economy. So I'll try to give you an overview on those things. First, let me just emphasize that the recession we've entered is a worldwide recession. It's the biggest recession the world has been in since World War II. And it's the most synchronized recession. By that, I mean the most countries in recession at the same time since 1870. And of course, in 1870, there were a lot fewer countries. So many of them were part of colonial groups. They went into recession at the same time. So this is a massive worldwide shock, and that has implications for recovery. Now, there has been an unprecedented response by policymakers to the crisis. Let me just mention it right away. So what I have here are two graphs. On the left panel, you have unconventional monetary policy. By unconventional monetary policy, we mean things like asset purchases, various programs like that, as opposed to normal monetary policy, which is changing non-borrowed reserves to affect interest rates. Now, if you look at the left panel, you can see the blue bar is the COVID response, and the orange star is the response during the global financial crisis. You can clearly see that in the United States, in the Euro area, and in Japan, the response is much bigger. A much bigger response in terms of unconventional monetary policy. It's huge in the US. If you look on the right panel, you can look at fiscal support measures. So things like in the US, the Paycheck Protection Program, stimulus payments. And again, you see that fiscal support measures are much larger in this COVID crisis than they were in the wake of the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Though you see that Japan is ahead of us in terms of fiscal support. We're about even with the European area. Okay. Oops. Let me, just to fix ideas, mention the various recovery shapes that people have talked about. I don't want to emphasize too much, but the optimistic scenario is the V-shaped recovery. That's the upper left panel. In the V-shaped recovery, the economy, well, in all the panels, the economy falls dramatically, but it recovers fast and we return to trend. And so the losses are permanent, but the growth path we get back to, and so it's as if it's really a great vacation. If you go to the lower right, there's the worst panel. That's the L-shaped recovery. That's the case where it takes a long time for the economy to recover, and it never really gets back to trend. Or if it does get back to trend, it gets back to trend for a long time. In the upper right, you see the Nike shape. That's the swoosh. Okay, so we don't need to spend too much about that. Why is it likely that we're not going to have a V-shaped recovery? The simple answer to this question is debt. Corporate debt and government debt have both exploded as a result of the policy measures that the government has undertaken. And interest rates are very low. Credit is very available. That's created this phenomenon of zombie firms. A zombie firm is a firm that should be dead, but it's still alive, kept alive by very low credit. That means that resources that would be freed if those firms went out of business are not freed up. That'll have effects on future growth prospects. The large government debt will have could have problems as well. That could also limit future growth prospects. Eventually, we have to pay back that debt, or we'll have to write it off. which could possibly lead to inflation. A more fundamental reason that we might not have a V-shaped recovery is bankruptcy. Okay, the firms that can't get that credit, the smaller and medium-sized firms, restaurants, all sorts of service things, they don't go into restructuring, they go into bankruptcy, the enterprise is lost, it becomes hard to restart, so that can have a long-term consequence. So the key questions we really want to know are, will small business recover? Will medium business recover, I should say, too? And that depends on when will private spending recover, so we'll talk something about that, and when will employment recover. Okay, now there has been some bounce back in retail sales. I advertised some cool charts to come to show you something about that. This bounce back in retail sales is strongly connected to the stimulus payments the government has paid out. You'll see that in a moment. It implies that we may need to continue such policies because, as you'll see, much of the recovery in retail spending is coming from the low income side of households, the ones most dependent on the stimulus payments. So when we decompose spending by income levels of households, you'll see that. But it's also clear that stimulus payments are not enough. At the same time that there's been a bounce back in retail sales, there's been a tiny recovery in industrial production, almost imperceptible. Yet, there's been a large recovery in the stock market. So the stock market's behaving very different. Now that could be that the market anticipates we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. So I'll talk about why the stock market is behaving differently from other parts of the economy. Let me just show you here personal savings rate. This is the personal savings rate of US households. You can see what happened as a result of the lockdown. So the decline in spending has led to a massive increase in personal savings. It used to be that the US saved too little, therefore we had a trade deficit with the rest of the world. Now we're saving a lot because of the effects of the economic recession, and that is having impact on demand for all sorts of services, as we'll see, and that's having effects on employment. Here's the retail sales bounce. This is the standard number. You can see the sharp fall off in mid-March when everything shut down, and then the rapid recovery that happened soon afterwards. But this is not the cool graph. Let me show you some better ones. Here, you have this data is very high frequency data. It's daily data. It's coming from credit card and debt payment data from households. And you can see the rapid fall from the shutdown. And then you can see where the stimulus payments started on April 15th. And after April 15th, you can see the recovery in retail sales. This is for the country. You can see the fall is now about minus 11%. Of course, it fell over 30% in the early part of the lockdown. I have the same picture for Pennsylvania. Again, the big fall, and then April 15th comes, the stimulus payments are sent out, and you see a recovery in retail sales. Pennsylvania, we've done better than the national average. The total fall in Pennsylvania is only about minus 5%. I suppose that's because we don't have any tourism business in Pennsylvania. Now, here is the same data split with the low-income households and high-income households. And this is a very revealing graph. Again, you see April 15th, the date when stimulus payments were sent out. And you see that low-income households responded much more than high-income households responded. Okay, the high-income households are still taking a vacation from spending. Low-income households, who are more dependent on the stimulus spending and have less of a cushion and less things they can defer, their spending has recovered much faster. So that's where we think the dependence on the stimulus payments is important to keep that part of the recovery. Of course, the stimulus payments don't affect high-income households, but that's probably not the reason. That's certainly not the reason high-income households aren't spending. The reason high-income households are not spending is because the things they like to spend on, it's hard to do right now. Okay? What I mean is that unlike previous recessions, I mean, all recessions basically involve large declines in the demand for durable goods and not much of a decline in services. But in this recession, the expenditures on landscaping and swimming pools, they did not decline. What declined is hotels, and therefore, you know, the employees, the maids in the hotels, transportation, dining out, barbers. You can see from my hair, barbers. Those are the things that declined. Services that were supplied by small businesses bore the brunt of the decline. I mean, airlines, I guess, and passenger ships are an exception to that, which has meant that the big impact is on the employment of low-income workers. And the data shows, I don't have a graph to show you, but the data does indicate that it's not just low-income workers, it's low-income workers who live in high-income communities. Think of low-income workers who work in Manhattan. They're the ones who've really suffered. What this all suggests is that the spending decline was not due to a decline in purchasing power. It's not a demand-driven effect. It's a COVID fear effect. Basically, what you have is people not going to restaurants, not because they have a decline in incomes and they can't afford to go to restaurants. It's that restaurants can no longer supply a healthy meal at any normal price. So it's a supply shock in some sense. And a recovery won't occur until there's a decline in fear, which is an important factor. Here's a picture which shows what I just was saying. These bars are all reflecting declines. So the bigger the bar, the bigger the decline. And it compares the Great Recession with the COVID-19 recession. And you're seeing the change in consumer spending by sector. So the Great Recession was like a normal recession. Durable goods fell dramatically. So things like auto purchases, refrigerators, items that you purchase every few years. In the COVID recession, the decline in durable goods spending is much smaller. But if you look at services, there's a huge decline in services in the COVID recession. There was no decline in services. There was an increase in demand for services during the Great Recession. So this is a dramatic difference in the nature of spending in a recession, and it's because it's a fear-induced recession as opposed to a typical demand shock-driven recession. Here you can see sort of the same thing with the daily data spread out into various sectors. At the top, you can see at-home swimming pools and landscaping. I wasn't joking when I used those two categories. You can see that there's almost no change in consumer spending on landscaping. But you see a big decline in restaurants, airlines, and barber and beauty shops. Maybe that barber shops eventually recover, but we'll see about airlines and restaurants. You see a very significant difference in items of spending. I mentioned before there was a tiny rebound in industrial production. There you see it, a dramatic decline and almost no recovery. And that's because of partly problems of organizing industrial production. In many factories, you just can't have people together because it's not safe, and partly because of declines in demand for goods. Although, not for landscaping goods. So what are the threats to recovery? The major question is, how quickly can spending return? How quickly will people start going back to malls, going back to restaurants, and flying? I put in this bullet, fear of a second wave, because I wrote this last week, but now it appears, well, the first wave is not even close to ending. I mean, Texas is about to end its lockdowns. So there's a serious problem with extension of the problem. And until we solve the health problem, we're not going to get the economic recovery. A really important economic factor, however, is that if we have extended unemployment, then we get a severe depreciation of the human capital of those workers who are unemployed. Long spells of unemployment can have permanent effects on workers. Even if they get reemployed in tasks that they're less suited to and that pay less. It's not clear that jobs will recover in the places where people have lost the jobs. So if the recovery is not rapid, that can have longer lasting effects, and that makes it hard to have a rapid recovery. Okay, I mentioned bankruptcy of medium and small businesses before. I just want to re-emphasize that when Hertz goes bankrupt, it goes into Chapter 11 protection so it can restructure. Basically, bankruptcy for Hertz simply means that the stockholders are wiped out. But it doesn't mean that the business is wiped out. The business will come back. But bankruptcy for medium and small businesses goes into a different Chapter 7 where the firms are liquidated. And when they're liquidated, the only way those resources can be used is if some new business starts. And that is much more difficult to organize, especially when the economy's in a downturn. A separate threat to recovery, and a really important one, is the threat to globalization. This recession, already before the recession started, we were entering a period of tariff wars, which was having a significant impact on globalization, but the pandemic has accelerated the threat to globalization. And it has to be recognized that the improvements in world transport, containerization revolution, the increase in globalization was one of the largest positive productivity shocks of the post-war era. I mean, global growth in the post-war period was greatly accelerated because of globalization. A decline in globalization will make economic recovery, worldwide economic recovery, much more difficult, as is the fact that the recession is global, which means that we can't rely on other parts of the world economy to help us out of recovery. Here is a picture showing global trade growth. You can see, this is the growth in world trade, 2017 to today. The orange bar is giving the lowest level of global trade growth in post-World War II history. You can see that in 2020, we'll surpass that. 2021 is a forecast, so we don't know how much it will recover, but of course, a 5% growth recovery after a 13% decline means that we still haven't come back to where we were. So this is a very large global trade growth decline, which is going to have serious impacts. Okay, let me talk about the stock market for a minute. The interesting question is, why is the stock market not fallen as much as the rest of the economy? Let me see if I have a picture here. Look at this picture here. You have to look carefully. I have to describe it. The yellow line is the unemployment rate, and the white line, or the blue area, is the S&P 500. This is from January of this year to last week. And what you see is that the stock market started to decline right away. Asset markets tend to price news much faster than the rest of the economy. So the unemployment rate, the S&P 500 declined dramatically, and unemployment has been increasing, and the stock market is impervious to that. So the question is, why is the stock market behaving differently than the rest of the economy? One possibility is that investors anticipate a V-shaped recovery. And there are no doubt some analysts who do, especially around Wall Street. But it's not necessarily the case that it's just anticipation of a quick recovery. You have to remember that equity prices depend on future earnings, and future earnings have to be discounted, and we have to use the interest rate to discount them. And if interest rates are very low, that means it's not just the near future, but the far out future earnings are important. If you have high interest rates, then earnings that are going to be earned 10 years from now have less effect on present values than earnings in the near period. So it could be that what investors expect are very low interest rates for a very long time, not necessarily a quick rebound in earnings. Now, the better explanation, perhaps, for the stock market's behavior is the Fed's unconventional monetary policy, which I mentioned before. The Fed's balance sheet currently exceeds $7 trillion. That is, as a result of all of the asset purchases, the credit that's been extended, it's doubled in the last 3 months. It's likely to reach 10 trillion by the year's end. So this huge increase in the size of the Fed's balance sheet, much bigger than after the Great Recession when people were complaining about what the Fed was doing. Excess reserves at the Federal Reserve are over $3 trillion. The result of all this liquidity is very low interest rates. The 10-year government bond yield today is 0.67%. The question is, where can all this liquidity go? And a lot of it's gone into the stock market. People refer to this sometimes as the Powell put option, setting a floor on asset prices. There's an expectation that if the stock market declines, the Federal Reserve will extend even more credit. The Federal Reserve is now buying assets of corporate bonds, for example, and other things. This liquidity has to go somewhere, and so it ends up in the stock market. Here's a picture of the Fed's balance sheet. You can see the Fed's balance sheet started to accelerate with the first quantitative easing program after 2008. And there was quantitative easing in 2010 and in 2013, and the Fed got criticized a lot for it. It tried to taper back a little bit, and now you see this dramatic acceleration in 2020, which is labeled, I guess, unlimited quantitative easing because it does seem to be growing without bound. Okay, I want to mention something about some of these programs that we've implemented. So first, I want to say something about the effectiveness of the Paycheck Protection Program. This data, we now have data on hours worked, and we can see hours worked by different kinds of firms. And so we can see what happened to the change in the number of hours worked by firms of different sizes, and how that affected employment. So here we have the firms that are very large. The very large firms are in purple, over 1,300 employees. Those firms were not eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. The green are firms that are 100 employees or less. They were eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. And what you see is employment is the same in both kinds of firms, which is saying it's saying that there isn't really a differential impact. So it hasn't had the Paycheck Protection Program has not really helped change employment very much in firms that were eligible for the program. So that suggests that's not been such an effective program, although There are stories that there's going to be large layoffs when the Paycheck Protection Program expires, in which case maybe what this is saying is that those small firms were going to be even worse shape than the large firms, and they've only managed to be in the same shape because of the program. That's a possibility. Here is an interesting picture about the effect of ending lockdowns. So this is a comparison of spending, consumer spending in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Okay, Minnesota and Wisconsin, well, you know, they're neighbors, they're very similar, but their lockdowns ended at different times. You can see them in the graph. They closed at the same time. Minnesota opened before Wisconsin, and you can see that there's no appreciable effect. There's no difference, significant difference between Minnesota and Wisconsin when the lockdown ended, which is evidence, or at least it's an indication, that what's affecting spending is fear, not government restrictions. You know, people are not going to restaurants because they're scared of going to restaurants, not just because restaurants were closed, because now when they're opening, there's still low demand for restaurants, especially among high-income consumers. Okay, so in conclusion, the downturn is likely to extend for several years. It's not likely to be a great vacation. I don't think the V-shaped recovery is likely for these reasons. I think fear is the primary barrier to recovery, although another barrier to recovery is that we still haven't knocked down the growth of infections. And if the first wave is not over, who knows what the second wave will look like. The global nature of the problem makes it worse, and permanent impacts means that we might be suffering from this effect for a long time. Whoops, I went the wrong way. So there it is. Thank you very much.
All right, great, Barry. Thank you very much. Mark, I think you're going to switch back to our video at some point here. Okay, well, let me start with a question, Barry, about recovery and about fear. Does that suggest that this situation isn't going to improve until we have a vaccine? Because the vaccine might be something that knocks down that fear factor. And if it does, could we get that hoped for V-shaped recovery that is just, you know, a year delayed compared to what we thought?
Well, the problem, okay, it's certainly the case that vaccines would really help because that would reduce the fear. The problem is if the recession, if it takes, let's say, till next spring to get a vaccine, then the unemployment and the impact on small businesses will be quite severe. The government's going to have to keep doing fiscal stimulus and unconventional monetary policy. Debt will get higher and higher. So the ability for the economy to recover will be larger. The impact on workers will be greater. And, you know, so it'll be hard to have a rapid recovery if all those small businesses are wiped out in the interim. That's the sort of problem.
Okay. So as you talk about small businesses and you talked about the Paycheck Protection Program, which was going to individuals, you know, and you talked about big and small firms, is there sort of a direction here that we should or shouldn't be doing individual support programs versus support for small businesses, like preventing bankruptcy, versus investing in big businesses where you might have some trickle down potentially? Is there a sector or, you know, a kind of a direction here that this would suggest?
I think that the best idea is support for the impacted individuals. So unemployment, extending unemployment benefits, extending stimulus payments to recover spending is probably better than subsidies to various sectors to keep them open, because we don't know exactly, whether they're zombie firms or whether they're firms that would likely survive the recession if it ended. If there's a big decline in hotel occupancy, I mean, that has a big effect on hotel earnings, but it has a much bigger effect on the earnings of the maids and the cooks and the people who work in the hotels, and their declines in income leads to lack of spending in their communities, which multiplies the impact. It's much better, I think, to deal with unemployment and stimulus directly to get spending back than supporting the businesses necessarily.
Well, with supporting individuals, you demonstrated that the spending, has increased for lower income households and not for higher income households. And that's because of the short, people don't have savings. They can't afford to not spend their paycheck. Is there a way to encourage the high income, potentially higher income spenders to actually start spending instead of savings? You talked about the savings rate, and it seems like careful not to say that it's too high now, but could we encourage spending by those higher income households, and could that affect, or is it just that, again, the demand, there aren't trips available for people to take?
Right. I mean, that's the big problem is when people aren't going to the movies, aren't going to restaurants, aren't going on trips. That's what the richer people do. They're still, they're still buying cars and other things, although, there's been some decline in that, but not that much. I suppose that some of it is even households leaving, Manhattan to go live in their summer homes. Well, they're not employing their maids in Manhattan anymore. And so that spending has gone down. So it's not clear what, in the absence of restaurants being able to reopen and, theaters being able to reopen. I mean, imagine all the Broadway theaters. I mean, not that I ever go to one, but all the Broadway plays, there's no Broadway plays anymore. That's got to be a lot of spending, I imagine, by rich people in Manhattan. And certainly Beaver Stadium's not going to be filled up this year. There's a lot of decline in spending. So that's the problem. When we get a recovery in that, then we'll get. The problem is that people are not substituting their spending. So one possibility could be that I don't go to a restaurant, I buy more clothing, right? But, clothing and dining are not really complementary goods. So, and people are just not doing that. They're not shifting into other categories of spending. If that were the case, then this effect would be much smaller. If there were other types of goods people would just shift it towards, then that would solve the problem. But instead, people prefer to defer the spending till a period when they will be able to buy what they want.
Okay. Another question that's been asked, an idea suggested, we've heard about infrastructure spending bills for a dozen years. And as something after the last recession, would an infrastructure bill help?
Well, infrastructure wouldn't hurt because we have a demand for infrastructure that's independent of the recession. We need investment in infrastructure anyway, despite all the short-term factors. I mean, one problem with it as a recession-fighting tool is it takes a long time to ramp up infrastructure spending. So if the Congress passed an infrastructure bill now, it's unlikely that spending would start to increase really before next summer. And of course, it would be beneficial because we need the infrastructure and it would increase demand. It wouldn't solve the employment problems for those who are unemployed, because the people who are unemployed wouldn't work in the construction sectors that we didn't see demand increase from infrastructure. But I mean, for a long-term perspective for America, infrastructure spending is a good idea. It's probably not the most effective, it's not the most effective way to deal with a recession, but it's not a bad idea.
Okay. So you mentioned the circumstances that we're in with a lot of debt. And some of that comes about from, long-running U.S. policy. Some of it comes from a big tax cut relatively early in the Trump administration. Let's say you had a new administration and you had a Biden administration who sought to roll back that tax cut, what would the effect of that be on recovery? And related to that more generally, a dozen years ago, people talked all the time about the size of the debt and the deficit. And we've seen the deficit increase dramatically. And the conversation about the size of the debt and the size of the deficit, there aren't any conversations. Is that passé? Is it going to come back? And if tackling the deficit means increasing taxes, what's the effect? So there's a bundle of things going on there.
Okay, yes. First, I'll make a statement that is not from my expertise, but if there is a Biden administration, immediately people will start talking about the deficit. As soon as the Democrats are in power, there will be lots of discussion of the size of the deficit. Okay, it's only not discussed when Republicans are in power. That's my empirical observation from the last 25 years, which is hard to refute. But okay, I'll leave that aside. Let's talk about the economics of the question. The economics of the question. It depends. First of all, a rollback of the tax cuts depends on how it's done. One possibility is you roll back tax cuts for corporations, but you offset it with tax cuts, say, for payroll taxes or low income or medium households. Or is it just a tax increase altogether? You could. I don't see any way in which there'd be a repeal of the corporate tax cuts until the economy's recovered. We're not going to do that. That's not going to happen while the economy's still in recession. I can also say, if there's talk about repealing the corporate tax cuts, the stock market will look like the rest of the economy. Okay, so that I'm certain of. But so there is a question of taxes are going to have to be raised in the future because we have to pay back some of this debt. I mean, we could inflate it away, but it's been very hard to generate inflation in the U.S. recently. Maybe we will inflate it away in the future. That's another possibility. Or the economy could recover its growth, but that seems a less likely possibility. But I don't think it's likely that if we're not going to have a recovery for 2 years, we're not going to have a tax increase for 2 years. I think that's probably likely because it's not a good time. It's not a good idea to raise taxes in a recession. So I don't think that will happen. There may be a shift in the tax burden where taxes are raised on high-income people and cut for low-income people, or people get tax rebate. The low-income end gets a tax rebate. You could try a revenue-neutral switch in taxation. That would have a less deleterious effect on the economy. So that's possible. I don't know if that's politically feasible, but that would be an economically feasible thing to do. If there was a desire, to restore more equity in the tax system, for example.
Okay, thank you. So along with the hoped-for vaccine, the U.S. and the world have been evolving to figuring out what is effective at combating COVID. And the use of masks and physical distancing seem to have been effective. We're learning more about it. It doesn't seem to be surfaces. It seems to be conversations. Places that did not implement masks and physical distancing perhaps are seeing the greatest increase in infections. Given practices that are being recommended, are those any impediment to safer to economic recovery? You know, can restaurants recover if people have to wear masks?
Well, certainly, if we had more adherence to sort of safe behavior, let's call it safe behavior, distancing and wearing masks, that would slow the spread. I mean, that seems evident from what happened in Texas and Florida recently. And it seems the evidence is that a lot of the recent infections are from the younger crowd, or hitting younger age groups, because they're the ones who are most likely to go to bars and not wear a mask. We've even seen, but we've seen growth in infections in California as well, where some of the social distancing was more effective than it was in Texas and Florida. Certainly that will help. The big problem is, if you social distance in a restaurant, that means you only have the restaurant filled to 50% occupancy. And if the restaurant is filled to 50% occupancy, it's not clear how viable an enterprise it is. Because you can't raise the price of food to cover, if you raise the price of food to cover the lowered occupancy, then people won't go to the restaurants because it'll be too expensive. I mean, people don't want to, you know, be spending twice as much for the meal they used to, you know, get a while ago. So that's a problem. I mean, if people wore masks and we didn't have to social distance, it'd be a little better. But of course, that spreads the virus. I don't have a good solution to that problem at all. But restaurants, they face a big problem because it's hard to earn when you have distancing. I mean, during the summer, people can sit outside in restaurants, and that could be pretty effective for some recovery. But once summer's over, that's not going to be a solution.
Okay. We sort of have time for one more question, but there are two that I really want to ask. So I'll put them both out there and you can answer either one. So a lot of states have constitutional requirements for balanced budgets. Their revenues are going down, and so they are potentially going to have to change spending. What effect might that have on the economy? And the other question is, can you speculate at all about the effect of work from home, which has increased dramatically, on things like real estate markets, the economy more generally, the cost of work for workers at home who have to, you know, perhaps buy computer equipment? So two separate things. You can answer either or both, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, the first thing about state and local, state governments and the fiscal impact, that's a very important issue. That's can't be good if states have to cut spending at this time. Most of their spending is on services or education or, you know, whatever. So that would just contribute to the economic problem if states have to cut spending in response to balanced budget constitutional requirements. So that would be a big problem. That's the worst thing that could happen, and it's a serious problem. I have nothing other, I mean, that's just so certain that I just say that. In terms of working at home, of course, that is one of the very big differential impacts on low-income and high-income households, because it's the high-income households who can work at home, and it's the low-income households who typically are essential, or, you know, they can't work at home. So it's had this very differential impact. I don't know that of course it has differing impacts on county by county spending, and it'll have different impacts on county by county employment. So for example, you know, in the poorer counties where people, you know, have to spend, you know, the employment impact is less than in the Connecticut's or wherever where that doesn't happen. But I don't know the impact on real estate prices. I mean, that tends to be a longer lived decision. So I don't know exactly, although I do think that as a result of this working at home experiment, some businesses will permanently change and some businesses will move. Some businesses will move out of dense areas. Some businesses will see, why do we have to all be in Manhattan? Why can't we be in suburbs? Some people will see, why do I have to have all my workers in the office? I could have some workers working at home. They may be more productive at home than they are in the office. In which case that could lead to a change in the location of employment. And that could be a big impact. You oftentimes get unforeseen structural changes as a result of an economic shock. But since they're unforeseen, it's very hard for me to forecast what they will be. But it's likely that this shock will have such structural changes that we'll be able in the future to date from now. I'll say that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right. It's an experiment, and it's a forced experiment that nobody wanted to have, because the discussion used to be, how do I keep my workers in line if they're working from home? And that question went away to just, we've got to send workers home. So
yes, World War I led to withholding of income for income tax purposes. Without World War I, we might not have ever had withholding. Now we have withholding ever since. I mean, shocks have effects that we don't anticipate.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to call it there. Barry, thank you. That was great. Some of those graphs, I've never seen those nationally or emphasized, and the differences in income groups and so on. It's fascinating. So thank you for all that today. And for our audience, thanks again for tuning in. We appreciate your interest and involvement in this and all of our other webinars. And I hope you found them as interesting as I have, and hope you all stay safe, and we'll see you at some point in person on campus. And until then, take care.